Welcome back to the Living Wisdom podcast. The focus of today's monologue will be Jean-Paul Sartre, the 20th century French philosopher, famous for his existentialism. And this comes after two monologues on first Ovid, the Roman poet, and Robert Solomon, the American existentialist of recent years, and then Freud's Mourning and Melancholia. After I talk about Sartre, I would like to synthesize all of these thinkers in anticipation of a dialogue about the Black Mirror episode, Be Right Back. But before I talk about Sartre, I'd like to just review what I said in an earlier monologue about Hegel, the 19th century German philosopher. Now, I spoke about Hegel in a monologue that also discussed Aristotle and Marx and set up a discussion of the Black Mirror episode 15 Million Merits, which is, roughly speaking, a critique of capitalism. So the themes that I used Hegel to talk about then were economics and politics. Today, I'm going to use Hegel as background for Sartre, and the emphasis will not be politics or economics, but rather the individual, and in particular, love. So let me just review the basics of the master-slave dialectic. First of all, Hegel thinks fundamentally that consciousness strives to become aware of itself. Consciousness seeks self-consciousness. And secondly, consciousness is not able to do this by itself. Put a person on a desert island and they're not going to become self-aware in the sense that Hegel is discussing. Rather, consciousness becomes self-consciousness when it encounters another consciousness. These two consciousnesses, these two people. It's in their encounter that each becomes aware of himself or herself. So people need each other because, for many reasons, of course, but in this context, people need each other to become aware of themselves, not just aware of the other as the other, but aware of the self as the self. And in fact, when Hegel describes two abstract people or two consciousnesses encountering each other for the first time, each in that quest for self-consciousness is seeking recognition for itself as self-conscious and free and rational, certainly free of the demands of nature. And it's because these two abstract people, two men, certainly Hegel thinks, encountering each other, each seeking recognition, that a conflict inevitably arises. And in the earlier monologue, I talked about how that might be plausible. And when I talk about Sartre, I think we'll see a version in which it is plausible, and even in everyday life, in love relationships. But at any rate, these two consciousnesses, seeking self-consciousness, seeking recognition from the other, get into a conflict. And ultimately, to achieve recognition for being independent from nature, one must be willing to sacrifice one's life. So A and B meet, and both A and B want to be self-conscious. Both A and B want to be recognized by the other as free and independent from nature. And as a result, both A and B need to be willing to sacrifice each his own life in order to achieve that goal. But that on occasion, one of them wishes to live more than he wishes to achieve that recognition. And so he surrenders to the other, who is actually willing to sacrifice his life in this battle. And the one who surrenders becomes a slave to the other, who is now a master. Because they were seeking recognition, the slave has obviously failed to achieve recognition as free and independent of nature, because he showed himself to be a slave to nature. Not to equivocate, he showed himself to be too mired in nature to rise above it and risk his own life. And so he doesn't achieve recognition. And the thought is, well, then the master achieves recognition. He's the winner in that contest, isn't he? But no, because now he's recognized not by a fellow self-conscious, dignified, willing to risk his life person, but instead by a slave. And in fact, any recognition that the slave gives the master, yes, master, whatever you say, master, will be bitter to the master, at least insofar as he's seeking recognition, because it won't be given freely. It won't be given rationally. It won't be given independent of nature. The slave will be saying those things ultimately because the slave wants to live, not because he thinks they're really true. So the master doesn't either achieve what he sought in that conflict, namely recognition. Both master and slave fail to achieve what it is that they wanted. And Hegel goes on to describe, and I talked about it more in the earlier monologue, how it is that a dialectic ensues. That is to say, a change happens, how eventually the slave, if he doesn't become the master at least becomes equal to the master. So much then for Hegel, or at least for our quick review. What does this have to do with Sartre? Well, very briefly, before I get into the details and set it up, very briefly, Sartre thinks that a love relationship is like the kind of conflict that Hegel has just described, and that both the lover and the beloved are seeking recognition or the love of the other, but are made anxious by the fact that the other is a free person who may deny that love. And so each is seeking to control the other to achieve the recognition and the love that he wants. And there's a temptation, therefore, to control the freedom, and yet that will make the other into a slave whose love won't be worthwhile, for the same reason that the recognition that the slave gives the master is not going to be worthwhile to the master. So that's just very roughly the Hegelian background of what Sartre says about love, and I'll now set that up more from the beginning. I'm referring now to Sartre's magnum opus, Being and Nothingness, and maybe as a first premise, it's worth saying just a little bit about what Sartre calls the other. Think of yourself sitting on a park bench. This is the example that Sartre uses. And you look around yourself, you see grass, trees, a sidewalk, and so on. And these are things in themselves. They don't have consciousness. But then you look a little farther and you see a man walking along the sidewalk. And you can see him as a thing in himself in the way that you see the grass or the sidewalk itself or another park bench, namely just something with a body in space, in time, an object. Or I should rather say, as well, you can think of him as a being for himself, namely a consciousness who has his own purposes and from whose standpoint the world appears a certain way. That being for itself, that man in that example, is now what we'll call the other. Sartre's, at least in the translation, capital O, other. And he says, I must apprehend the other first as the one for whom I exist as an object. So when I am looking from my park bench and I see the grass, I don't exist as an object for the grass. The grass is completely oblivious to me because the grass is not conscious. So likewise for the sidewalk and all the other inanimate objects. But when I look at the man, the other, I recognize that he too is seeing the grass and the sidewalk and the park benches and so on, and then seeing me. I am for him an object. Now, it could be an object in the sense I described first when I encountered him, namely, he's seeing me as just another thing in the world, like the sidewalk or the grass and so on, just another thing in space and time, a body. But as well, he may distinguish me from the rest of the environment in the same way that I distinguished him from the rest of the environment. He may recognize that I am another center of consciousness beside himself. So what we have here is a more mundane encounter than Hegel described, where it, proceeds to a bloody battle to the death or a master-slave relationship, but an everyday encounter between two people who are minding their own business and encountering the world as not conscious, and then recognizing there is another consciousness in their experience. And it's not just that A recognizes that B is another consciousness, but B also recognizes that A is another consciousness. And you can multiply it ad infinitum. A recognizes that B recognizes that A recognizes B's consciousness, and so on for both of them. When that happens, the consciousness, let's say you, if you're the first person there sitting on the bench, you become aware of yourself because you now are able to see yourself, or at least you now realize that someone is seeing you from the outside, and you become aware of yourself as a self. So this is an illustration of that basic premise, I called it, in Hegel, that we need other consciousnesses to become aware of ourselves. Self-consciousness arises not on its own, but rather in the interaction between multiple consciousnesses. A good example of this in Sartre is the keyhole in a chapter called The Look. So imagine yourself looking through a keyhole, as he says, either because of jealousy, curiosity, or vice. You're looking through the keyhole and you're trying to get a view of the room through the keyhole. You're not aware of yourself. You're thinking hard about what's the right angle to see whatever it is that you're trying to see. And you just got it right. And then you hear footsteps behind you. All of a sudden, you're brought into an awareness of yourself looking through the keyhole. And Sartre elaborates how that self-consciousness can either be a point of pride or a point of shame. Presumably here it would be a point of shame because of the vice or the curiosity or the jealousy or whatever. But it is an awareness of that other, that consciousness that's walking up behind me. It's an awareness of that other's perception of me or thoughts about me, that awareness of me that makes me aware of myself in certainly a heightened way, and most fundamentally, at all. Self-consciousness requires the presence of another consciousness. Granting that, there's now a problem of, I'll call it alienation. Here's what Sartre says. The other's existence reveals to me the being which I am, without my being able either to appropriate that being or even to conceive it. So in the keyhole example, I'm here riffing on it, but imagine that I have good motives for looking through the keyhole, whatever those might be. Let's say I'm a detective and I'm not just curious, but performing an investigation. But the man who walks up behind me sees me as a pervert. Well, that other has revealed to me, I'm quoting now again, the being which I am, namely, he's got an idea of me as a pervert. I become aware of myself as, in his eyes, a pervert, and I'm not able to control what's going on in the mind of that, in that other consciousness. So, again, reviewing the premises, if to become aware of ourselves, we must engage with other consciousnesses. To become aware of oneself, where you're owning yourself, also involves a certain degree of alienation, because it's the awareness of you that others have, which is giving birth to your own awareness of yourself, is out of your control. And in this pointed example, you can see why there would be shame in the other person's thought, conviction that you are indeed a pervert. And you can't do anything about that. So just to repeat that quotation, the other's existence reveals to me the being which I am, without my being able either to appropriate that being or even to conceive it. Now, of course, this is just one example. You could think, as I do when I want to object to this, that, well, he's just wrong. I'm not a pervert. I'm a detective. I'm looking through this keyhole. He doesn't make me who I am just because he has a false view about me. But this is just one example. I think Sartre's using it as a way of saying, this is happening all the time. It's been happening from the beginning of our lives, and our very idea of who we are, our very idea of, in this case, that I'm a detective seeking the truth, is, at least to some extent, if not wholly, constituted by others' awareness of me as such. So it's only because I went to the police academy and was perceived as a detective by the other authorities in the police academy that I then think of myself as authentically a detective. So we need others, and yet others are a threat to us because, as he says, they hold the secret of our being. And this can be threatening, and I hope the example makes it clear, because if the secret of our being is not a secret that we accept or that we want, we can try to then control the other. And so he says, I can turn back upon the other so as to make an object out of him in turn, since the other's objectness destroys my objectness for him. So here, I don't like the fact that this man who's just walked up behind me and seen me looking through the keyhole thinks of me as a pervert. Well, I don't think that the hallway thinks of me as a pervert. The hallway is just an object, something in itself, like the grass in the first example in the field or the sidewalk and so on. I'm only threatened by this man's thought of me, by having the secret of my being, because I deem him as conscious, as having this power to have a perspective on me, to have a perception or a belief on me. if I can think of him as just like the hallway or just like the sidewalk or the grass, namely not having that kind of consciousness, not having that power, then I remove that threat. So Sartre thinks we do this a lot to each other. We don't like what the other thinks of us, and so we try to diminish the otherness of the other. We try to we treat the other, and we try, I think, get the other to see himself as just like the grass or the sidewalk or the hallway, namely not able to do what we feel so threatened by, namely have these alternate and shameful perceptions of ourselves. There's an irony here, however, that if one were successful in that, if, in this case, I treated the detective like he's worthless and made him feel so ashamed himself for having walked up upon me that he's just like the furniture in the hallway, I lose the other's perception of me, which I need for my own self-consciousness. So I think it's possible, again, to exaggerate the importance of one example and think, well, I don't all of a sudden become unaware of myself, lose my self-consciousness because I get one guy who walks up in a hallway to think of himself as no better than furniture. But if we adopt this attitude to everybody, since everybody is having perceptions about us all the time, many of which are not the ones that we want to hold of ourselves, that if I really want to control that threat, stamp out the power of others to possess the secret of my being, or reclaim myself that's been alienated into their minds rather than in my own, by denying their consciousness, well, I seem to solve the problem of that threat, but at the same time, I compromise my own self-consciousness. If we accept that original premise that self-consciousness requires the encounter with another consciousness. And here I hope the parallel with Hegel is clear. Sartre goes so far as to say that in the encounter with the other, we seek to enslave the other, where here slavery isn't, as it was in the dramatic Hegelian example of a bloody battle to the death, but rather diminishing the consciousness, the power of that person to have an alternate perspective. So when A and B encounter each other, A is trying to enslave B, again, not put B into chains, but rather remove the freedom B has to have a different perspective on A than A wishes to have on himself. But B is trying to enslave A in that same way. Each is trying to control the other. Each is trying to suppress the freedom of the other, because although they each need each other to be self-conscious, they also feel threatened by the power of the other and the freedom of the other to possess, as he says, the secret of their being. And so he concludes, conflict is the original meaning of being for others. Relationships are inherently conflictual, according to Sartre. So what about love? So far, what he's described is not loving, possibly sadomasochistic, in as far as each is trying to enslave the other. So what has love got to do with this? Well, it's a failed strategy to try and enslave the other for the reason that I mentioned, namely, you need the other's consciousness for your own self-consciousness. So that sadomasochistic route, that enslavement of the other route, that mastery and slavery, is a failed strategy for dealing with this problem. What about love? Sartre says that as self-consciousness, or as consciousness certainly, you have a project which is the recovery of your own being. Now, remember, your being, the secret of who you are, gets alienated into the minds of others, and that can lead you to engage in a master-slave dialectic or a sadomasochistic relationship. But he holds out the possibility that you might recover your being somehow in another way. And that's what love is. So what is that other way? He says, my project of recovering myself is fundamentally a project of absorbing the other. Now, that could be given a sadomasochist or certainly sadistic twist, where absorbing the other means stamping out the consciousness of the other, metaphorically speaking at any rate, denying that person's power, getting that person to believe that he's not got the power to hold a different perspective on me than I have about myself. But here, Sartre is trying, I think, to describe another route, where absorbing the other is not denying that consciousness its power by making it an object, but rather, as he says, identifying myself totally with my being looked at. So maybe to fuse examples for the moment as a segue, there I am looking through the keyhole, not aware of myself at all. The man walks up behind me, let's say a stranger, looks at me. I hear him walking up. I feel his look upon me. I myself now is alienated because I'm aware of the fact that he thinks I'm a pervert, and I don't think that I am. I could stand up and we can get into an argument about it, but this is perhaps implausible, but just for the purpose of explanation, if I were to fall in love with him, if I were to accept his perception of me, if I were to identify myself totally with my being looked at, that promises another possibility. Now, again, in that scenario, it's absurd, but think of, if not love at first sight, then the early stages of a love relationship where the lovers feel as if they're soulmates, as if they share all the same judgments. Part of that conceit is that if I'm in love with you, the way you see me is something that I'm going to identify with. And certainly as two people are falling in love, they think so well of each other that it's painless to do so. In fact, it's inflating to do that. But this hasn't quite solved the problem, because when two people are in love in that way, let's just take when one person is in love in that way with another person to simplify it, he's identifying with how he's being looked at, but hidden, certainly in the early stages, but typically grows. One becomes anxious about the other's freedom to change the way one is looked at. And of course, again, this is Hegel's master-slave. When two people are in love, they want the other person to be giving that love freely. They don't want to be loved, as Sartre will say, and I'll read it in a moment. They don't want to be loved by an automaton or by a robot, nor do they want to be in love with an automaton or a robot. They want to be loved and be in love with a free person. What that freedom creates is the possibility that that way that you are seeing me, if we're in love, could change. And right now I'm identifying with the way that you see me, but if it could change into its opposite, or if it could just degrade from the way it is now, that makes me anxious. So now there's an anxiety in love that's going to, I think, reproduce the dialectic, the sadomasochistic problem from earlier. Namely, in order to overcome this anxiety, I will try to suppress your freedom. In order to control that anxiety, I'll try to subject your freedom to my freedom. Sartre gives the example of Proust, and I'll talk about Proust in a later episode. But Proust is madly and jealously in love with a girl named Albertine, or at least Proust's character Marcel is madly in love with Albertine, and he does everything he can to possess her. He controls her financially, he monitors all of her movements, but he recognizes, to his chagrin, that he can't control everything. And in fact, he's only really happy when she's sleeping, because it's as if she's lost her freedom at that moment and she can't fall out of love with him. But so long as she's aware and self-conscious and independent, free, there's the threat that the love will degrade, or the love will disappear, or the love will turn into its opposite. So now the paradox becomes, I want to be loved by a free agent. Agent sounds like a contractual relationship. I want to be loved by a free person. I want to be loved by somebody who freely chooses to love me. But that freedom creates an anxiety that then creates in me the temptation to enslave that person. Now, again, enslave is an extreme example, but limit the freedom of that person. Subject your freedom, that other person's freedom, to my freedom, in Sartre's language. Here's the quotation about the automaton that I mentioned earlier. He, the lover, is not bent on becoming the object of passion which flows forth mechanically. He does not want to possess an automaton. And if we want to humiliate him, we need only try to persuade him that the beloved's passion is the result of a psychological determinism. So imagine saying to your friend who's madly in love with somebody and who believes that he has the loving devotion of his beloved, that, well, in fact, she's just really in it for your money. She's just determined by her pursuit of wealth, and you're the rich person that she's fastened onto. Or to flip it round, to say to your friend, well, he's really just attracted to you for your body. He couldn't care less about your mind. He's just determined by his sexual appetite to pursue women of a certain sort, and so on and so on. Think of all the ways in which people are, to some extent, determined by their characteristics. The Otamatone is just an extreme example of that. And, of course, this shows up in Be Right Back in a way that I'll discuss in a moment. But to think of the person you love loving you because they need to, because there's a determination in them that they're seeking something that they are getting from you, but that they could get from somebody else, is deflating, and Sartre even says is humiliating. So there's a paradox. We want the beloved to be free, but we want the beloved to not be free. And enslavement is the extreme term for that, not freedom. Or again, as Sartre says, he wants a freedom which plays the role of determinism. So that if you love me, you want me to be free abstractly, because you'd be humiliated if you found out I was a robot, or I was just in it for your money, or just in it for your looks, or whatever. You want me to be free abstractly, but you also want me to be determined to love you, because if I'm not determined to love you, if I truly am free, then I might change my mind. Just to look briefly ahead to Be Right Back, the Black Mirror episode that these monologues are setting up, or rather the discussion about that episode that these monologues are setting up. Martha is in love with Ash. Ash dies. Ash is then replaced by a robot Ash, I'll call him. And if you know the episode, you know it happens with some intermediate steps. But she finds herself loving, maybe in quotation marks, having uncanny loving feelings towards this robot who is a, let's say, close to perfect replication of her dead husband. Now, there are some flaws in the replication that we'll get into in the discussion of the episode, but even if it were perfect, there would be a problem that we can now diagnose, I think, quite easily using this Sartrean theory of love, that she wants him to be free. She doesn't want to be loved by a robot. And the episode only works dramatically because we can imagine how easily a grieving widow would imagine the robot as her husband. In other words, if she were to keep at the forefront of her mind and heart the thought and feeling that this is a robot, then there wouldn't be any love for it. It'd be like a picture where there's a reproduction of the beloved, but there isn't love for the reproduction. There's love for the beloved, and one uses the picture to grieve. So, insofar as she's aware that this is a robot, she's not in love, because to be in love, she wants to be in a relationship with a free individual who's freely choosing to love her. And yet, she has ordered him, reluctantly at first, but she has ordered this robot because this robot and this company that produces these robots promises that it will be just like the dead husband. And, I mean, first of all, robots are determined. I mean, in a subsequent series of episodes, I'll talk about artificial intelligence and determination and so on. But in this case, the problem is deeper than that. It's not just that, in fact, this is a computer program that follows an algorithm and doesn't make free choices, but also that this robot has been deliberately programmed to follow patterns that were created by the dead husband when he was alive, patterns that he left in electronic and social media. So there are several problems here that I'll get into in the discussion about this episode, in the next episode of this podcast. One of them is that the person that we represent ourselves to be on social media and email and so on is not the same as who we really are. It's a simulacrum of ourselves, a certain presentation of ourselves. so that when you recreate somebody from that information, you're not getting the person, you're getting an embodiment of that representation. Putting that aside for the moment, though, there's the deeper problem that this robot is programmed to act as Ash acted before he died. In other words, take all of the things that Ash did, let's say a deeper program that doesn't just look at all social media, but reviews his entire life history, implausibly, but somehow records it all, codifies it, and creates a program such that the robot will do everything according to the patterns that were laid down by Ash when he was alive. That's determination. And ultimately, what Martha is upset about, what precipitates the end of this episode, is that she recognizes that she's not just looking for a perfect reproduction of her dead husband. She's looking for her dead husband. And what's the difference? The difference, I think, and I would certainly argue using the Sartre and some of the other authors that I've presented, the difference is that the dead husband, at least while he was alive, was free. And the reproduction of the dead husband is not free. He's programmed and determined. So here is her paradox boiled down in Sartrean terms. She wants to love and be loved by a free agent, but at the same time, she wants a reproduction of her dead husband. In other words, if they sent her a robot that somehow was free but did stuff that had nothing to do with what her dead husband did, then she wouldn't be satisfied by that either. So she's caught in a paradox of wanting Robot Ash to be free and not wanting Robot Ash to be free. And this excellent episode of Black Mirror, I think, dramatizes that paradox very nicely. But like so many of the other Black Mirror episodes, it's using a technology to highlight something that's already there in us. In other words, Sartre wasn't anticipating what it will be like to have love relationships with artificial intelligences. Sartre was describing what it's like to have love relationships with flesh and blood human beings. In other words, Sartre sees a paradox in everyday human love that Be Right Back exaggerates in the manner of Black Mirror, uses technology to cast in black and white terms so that we can see it, I think, more clearly than we can in our everyday life. And so I hope in this case that the Sartrean theory, which is difficult, as so many other continental philosophers of the 20th century are, to appreciate and understand, certainly, that with something like Be Right Back, you can see very clearly what I think the main point of Sartre on love is, namely that it stems from paradoxical desires. Okay, well, let me then try to synthesize the many authors that I've used to set up the next episode, which will be a discussion of Be Right Back. Let me just remind you of who those authors are. In this episode, I've talked about Hegel and Sartre. In the first of the 3 episodes for this unit, if you like, I talked about the Roman poet Ovid and also Robert Solomon, the American existentialist. And then in the most recent episode, I talked about Freud's Mourning and Melancholia. So Hegel, Sartre, Freud, Solomon, Ovid. There's a lot of thinkers. Let me try to synthesize them and make it clear why I've chosen these ones, not because they individually illuminate aspects of this Black Mirror episode, but also because I think they can fit together into a theory of melancholia. Now, I'm fresh from talking about Hegel and Sartre, so I can just summarize very quickly that they show us the futility of loving an automaton. At least Sartre shows that. In Hegel, it was the futility of expecting that the recognition a slave gives you will be satisfying to you as a master. And in the love idiom of everyday relationships, that comes out as the futility of expecting that the, quote, love you get from an automaton, an automatic slave, will be satisfying to you in your desire for love. Ovid gave us the original story, the Pygmalion story of loving an automaton. And we don't get in that distinct unit of Ovid's Metamorphoses the idea that it's a tragedy, but the offspring of Pygmalion and his girl, the statue who comes to life, eventually becomes a monster that is a bull that's placed in a labyrinth and to whom sacrifices of children are made every year. So reading it as a whole, there's something tragic about this story. Ovid's implying that there's inevitably something tragic about loving a slave or loving an automaton. In Freud, the theory was, well, I don't want to say more complex, certainly not more complex than Sartre's theory, but it's going to just take a little explanation to remind us of the main elements. Freud distinguishes between mourning and melancholia, where mourning is a normal process of grieving when you lose something or someone, especially in death, but also in divorce or betrayal, and so on. And the way Freud understands the psychodynamics, if you will, what's going on in the soul when you mourn, is that your love object, which was the focus of your desire, your libido in his terms, when it disappears from the world, that libido, which was reaching out to the world, has to learn, you have to learn, your soul has to learn not to cast that libido out to that part of the world because that object's no longer there, and you learn to cast it out somewhere else. Put simply, to fall in love with somebody else, to find somebody else who's, if not a replacement, then at least someone you can now love in the way that you loved that major object before. What goes wrong in melancholia? In melancholia, there's a kind of delusion that even though the person has died, the love object is gone, even though you might say to yourself as the melancholic, well, of course I know that my father is dead, your heart, your unconscious, your basic psychodynamics in the quasi-scientific Freudian terms hasn't accepted that reality. And so instead of withdrawing the libido from that missing object and displacing it onto a new object, instead the object is withdrawn into the soul. Now, that won't make literal sense. It's not that the dead father is somehow pulled into your skull, but rather an internal object is established, an imaginary father that is the focus of your love. And again, consciously you'll say, yes, of course I know my father has died. But if your father made pancakes for you every morning, for example, when you come down in the morning, even though consciously you know that your father is dead and that there are not going to be any pancakes on the table for you when you awake, nevertheless your heart reaches out. Something in you expects the pancakes to be there. You weep when the pancakes aren't there. That's normal mourning, of course, a week or a month or perhaps even a year after the death. But if it's still happening 10 or 20 years later, and of course that's just a symbol for how it is that 20, 30, 40 years later, you could still be living as if the person were still alive. Freud's explanation of what's going on in your soul is that there is an internal object now. Instead of the external object which has died, there's an internal object which your soul has manufactured, to which you are just as devoted as you were to the external object. And that libido, in his mechanical theory, is not freed up to be displaced to find a new love object. Now, you don't need to believe in Freud's psychodynamics and the exact equations of libido, where if you use it up here, there's not any to go over here. This can be understood, I think, more straightforwardly as the person hasn't moved on. The person's heart, the person's emotional investments are still oriented towards the lost object. But even though the conscious mind is saying the object has been lost, something unconsciously in that person's life, some orientation to the world, has not accepted that. And so they're constantly experiencing a sense of loss because they expect it to be there. That's where the sadness comes from. But also the delusion. Now you can see why it's a delusion, because the object is no longer there. The delusion doesn't show up as a person coming down and saying, where's dad? 30 years later, where are my pancakes? But rather trying to find a relationship with somebody who will play a role like the role that dad played, if not actually making pancakes, then being the kind of person who would make you pancakes every morning, and so on. Now, I've gone into detail about this again, because now with the Sartrean vocabulary at hand, I want to say that the internal object in the Freudian theory is an automaton. It's an internal automaton in the sense that it's not a free agent. This isn't a real person who, like a real dad, might just say, you know what, make your own pancakes, or get angry and as a result not make your pancakes, or say, I've loved making pancakes for the last 10 years, but I just am bored. I don't want to do this anymore. People surprise us because they're free. Internal objects don't surprise us. They're not there to surprise us. They're there to preserve the patterns of the relationship that existed before it ended, the patterns of the dad before he died. I hope now you can see, fresh from the discussion, a little short discussion of Be Right Back, that I'm using that same language because what I think Be Right Back does so brilliantly is it gives us an external object, namely Robot Ash, an actual automaton, but that it plays out the logic of Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, because in this understanding I'm giving you now, in Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, the internal object is just an automaton in yourself. And what's the problem with having an automaton in yourself? Well, if that's what you're in love with, the problems that Sartre described, that Hegel set him up to describe with loving an automaton, are going to be the same for you if you're melancholic as they would be for Pygmalion, because he's in love with a statue, or for Martha, who's in love, at least for a short time, with Robot Ash. Now, finally, Solomon. Solomon's theory is one of the emotions or the passions, that they're judgments, and that we live not only in reality of tables and chairs and podcasts and so on, but that we also live in a surreality where our emotional judgments, the complete constitution of emotional judgments we make about our status in the social world all the time, gives us an approach to life. And there's a stable constitution. There are the changing judgments, and then there are the laws that are a little more stable in his legal analogy. And then there's the Constitution, which sets up what kind of emotional judgments a certain kind of person is allowed to make. And I think that fits nicely, too, with the Freud, because what's going on in the melancholic is there's a stable constitution, a surreality that is constituted by a certain judgment. And now consciously, again, the judgment's going to be dad's dead. But unconsciously, in the Freudian explanation, the judgment is dad's alive. And so there's going to be the constant disappointment and sadness, because if this person is not going to become completely delusional, they're going to be living in a world where dad's dead, and yet internally their emotional constitution is such that he's alive. So there's going to be constant disappointment. But also the relationships that that person gets into are going to be distorted by that unconscious life, because that's where this person's passions are. That lived life is going to be unconsciously shaped to make it seem as if dad is in fact still alive. That's the transference that I mentioned in the earlier episode about Freud, of treating present people as if they are embodiments or avatars of previous love objects. And what's the problem with that? Again, the basic problem, I think, is best described by Sartre, coming out of Hegel. The basic problem is that surreality of the melancholic person, that set of judgments, is built around an internal, in Freud's terms, internal object, or in the Sartrean terms, an automaton. And the reason why that will never be satisfying, the reason why that person will be stuck, is that that automaton is not free, that that's not what people want when they want love. They want to be loved by a free person, not by someone who is determined. And so the challenge for the melancholic, I think, can be probably described in the Freudian terms. It's to switch from melancholia to mourning, to free up the libido, to begin new relationships. But that's only going to happen when the person becomes so dissatisfied with their relationship with that internal automaton that they just can't do it anymore. And again, that's why I think this is a brilliant Black Mirror episode, because that scene when Martha's on the cliffs and she screams into the void, I think that is her recognition that she can't do this anymore. She doesn't love the automaton. She loved her husband, but he's dead. This is not her husband. This is a psychologically determined, and in fact, literally determined because it's an artificial intelligence. It's a determined object. It's not a free object, and she can't love it anymore. She breaks, she screams, and then the next scene we get is 10 years later. The child has been born. She's got a different hairstyle. She's got different clothes. She's in a different apartment. She's got a new life. She's moved on. And that's what Freud's gesturing towards in the difference between mourning and melancholia. The mourner can move on, the melancholic can't. But he never tells us what working through is in that essay, repeating, remembering, and working through. And so I guess what I'm trying to give here is a theory of what it is to work through, is to change your surreality in Solomon's terms. And if you're a melancholic, the problem is you've got a surreality built around judgments about a dead person, a lost relationship, some kind of major loss in your life, as if you haven't lost it. You've internalized it, given it a life inside yourself, but it's not a real life. It's a program. And it's not until you become totally disenchanted with that fantasy that you'll be prepared to move on.